So let me just go back to the FreshSales interface, and what I'll do is I'll make a call to someone. You won't be able to hear the other side of the audio because the webinar doesn't show that to you. But as I have the conversation, you'll see cue cards pop up on my screen. Hello, Murli, can you hear me? Okay, great. So first thing to everybody who's on the webinar, the way Wingman is getting access to the audio for this webinar is through this Chrome plugin. So once the call started, this plugin changed color. It's now green. And what has also happened is that I now have this widget here on my screen, which is identifying that I'm speaking with Murli. It's also showing me the interface for the cue cards. Now, as we have this conversation, if there's anything important that Murli says or anything that I want to take note of, I don't need to type. All I need to do is I can click here. It'll bookmark that moment in the call. And later on, it'll provide me a list of all of those bookmarked moments with transcript, which I can easily even push back into the CRM directly. The second thing is, as I have this conversation with Murli, he might ask me questions about, hey, do you guys integrate with FreshSales? Or he might ask me questions about, what does that integration really look like? So because I set the word FreshSales, now this cue card has popped up, right? So I didn't have to do anything extra for this to show up. But what this does is that I immediately have full context on what I need to say in relation to this part of the conversation. Now, of course, I can configure different types of cue cards. This is just one of them. But I could have cue cards configured around behavior. So one of the things that we do is we also show cue cards around if somebody goes into a long monologue. So I don't want to be talking for 2 minutes. And if I cross that threshold, it'll start showing me a cue card asking me to pause, switch the conversation, give me other suggestions. Similarly, you might have instances where you don't want your reps or you don't want yourself to use certain words or phrases, right? So does that make sense, right? That's a pretty overused phrase. But every time I use that phrase, now this cue card shows up and it kind of just nudges me along to say, stop using that. So you could also use that for like gentle nudges on the behavior side. And of course, one thing that people don't recognize is how hard it can be to just handle objections. So you could also configure cue cards for handling objections, right? So, if I'm speaking to a customer and they say, hey, this is not a great time, can you try next quarter? I could have a cue card that just pops up and shows me talking points around, how do I counter that? So all of those things just work absolutely seamlessly through this. Let me end the call here with Murli. So essentially what we want the system to do is become an assistant to salespeople in real time and provide this assistance in the most seamless manner so that they don't have to do anything extra for this to work for them. Now, the question is, what happens immediately after the call? So the first thing that this does immediately after the call is it'll show me a summary of what happened in the call along with the transcript. So if I'm looking at any of my previous calls, I get a full transcript of the call. I also get highlighted moments in the call so that I don't have to go around searching for different parts of the call by navigating through a 30-minute call. So just to give you an example, right, this is one of my previous calls. This is the transcript. It's also showing me when it is that I was speaking versus the customer. And on the left-hand side, it's automatically highlighting different parts of the call, right? So if I wanted to go in and check where did I set up next steps, what were the next steps that we talked about, all I need to do is I just need to click here and I can get that. Similarly, if I have bookmarks in a call, it allows me to also navigate through the call using those bookmarks. One of the other things that people like to do, of course, at the end of every call is put that in the CRM. So let me just show you the bookmarks here, right? So in one of my previous calls, these are the bookmarks that I've clicked on. And as you can see, this can be really useful, both for me to personally go back and review my call, but also if I wanted to share parts of the call with, say, somebody else in my team, for me to be able to do that. So if I click here and add a comment, I can actually share this with maybe my product person and say, hey, this was a feature request. And if I tag them in that discussion, they'll actually get an email. And if your organization uses Slack, they'll also get a Slack notification for it. Coming back to the CRM piece of this, what I might want to do is I might want to capture some of these things, maybe especially around next steps, etc., into the CRM notes, right? Or maybe there was a pricing discussion that I want to capture back into the CRM. Now, what I can do then is I can just add a note from right here. It'll capture the note with the timestamp. And then in the CRM, when I'm reviewing my discussions with a particular client, I can see all of those conversations along with the call links. The call notes are right here as well. So this is all under the notes section in FreshSales. And all of this is happening automatically and in real time as the call's getting processed. Now, coming back to, what is it that a manager wants to be able to do once a call ends, right? So there are a couple of things that managers like to do. One is they want to be, of course, able to listen back on the calls just to understand what is, the revenue pipeline like. But very often what they also want to be able to do is to give feedback to their sales reps. So if I was a manager, what I could go in here and do is I could go in, tag the person and tell them, hey, this was a good moment. You handled that well. But I can also create, put in hashtags around it, which help me then create a playlist around those things. So I could have a hashtag around good moment pricing, which means that when I have new hires and I want to show them examples of great calls on how pricing was handled, I can do that just right here without any additional work, right? So I don't need to create a ton of training collateral when I get new hires, and I don't need to bother my old reps with being shadowed on several calls. I can instead just go in here, create these playlists, and make sure that it's available forever to any new person who joins the organization. So, before I jump into, the dashboards and the review aspect of the platform, I'd just like to remind everyone that we do have a Q&A after this, so feel free to ask your questions, and we'll be happy to take those up. Now, the other thing that, from a review perspective, managers want to be able to do is understand what is working in a sales call, right? What is it that people are doing well that's getting to improve conversions? And as you learn those things and as you provide feedback to people on those things, you'd want to be able to scale that up. And that's exactly the purpose of the cue cards. So let me just show you, what the cue card setup looks like. All right, so this is, some of the cue cards you might have seen during the call that showed up. But this is really what the cue card setup screen looks like, right? So This is, for example, a cue card on try next quarter and stuff. Now, as a manager, if I'm realizing that consistently my team is having a challenge in addressing maybe a trust-related question or in addressing, say, a discount request, what I can do is I can go in here and create a cue card that will get triggered every time somebody mentions the word discount. And then I can, say, talk about ROI and all that other good stuff that I want to have all my sales reps practice during the call. And that's it. And the next time when somebody has a call and the customer mentions the word discount, it's going to show up the cue card automatically. So this is an example of some of the different types of cue cards that people like to use. You could have cue cards around competitors. This is, again, getting to be a pretty hairy area because there's lots of competition for every type of product, and the competitor landscape's always evolving. And you want to be able to make sure that everybody has the right talking points for those because it's pretty crucial. Integration. So we talked about the FreshSales integrations example. The other thing that we help people do is also track through the agenda. So you might have a particular agenda for a qualification call where you want to cover maybe budget and need analysis and authority, and you could then have the tool automatically track through it and show you what you've already covered and what's still pending, just based on the conversation. So it becomes a great way for you to track the conversation. It's interesting. I mean, I think very often salespeople don't get the credit for how stressful the sales environment can be. And recently I was talking to somebody who told me that one of the rookie mistakes they made was they were pushing a customer really hard for understanding their timeline, and the customer said, "Hey, but why do you really want to know what my timeline is?" And they responded with, "Hey, that'll help me plan my quota and my targets better." And that's, of course, a horrible, horrible response. But what it shows is that, because it's such a high stress environment, it's sometimes hard for people to think on their feet. And a tool like this, which supports sales reps, can be really useful in helping them ease into the system, and also just being subtle reminders that make sure that they're able to stick to the script to talk about things the way they need to talk about things. Another interesting thing to note here is that very often sales reps are okay to paraphrase and say in their own words, the essence of the talk track. But sometimes the exact words matter. Not always, but sometimes they do. So recently I was talking to a company and they told me that some of their sales reps set up that follow-up call by saying, "Hey, would you be able to spare 15 minutes next week for a quick demo?" And in some cases, they have their sales reps set up the demo, but by saying, "Hey, you know what you've told me is really interesting, and I think there's a great alignment, and you would love to see a demo and could be set up time." And what they noticed was that the no-show rates in the first case were 3 to 4x higher than in the second case. So sometimes the exact vernacular of how a particular thing is said really does have an impact on the outcomes. And so the cue cards help ensure that you're able to kind of consistently drive a vernacular within your team. So I'll switch to the dashboard part. Now, from a manager's perspective, one of the things you want to be able to see is how are your different reps comparing against each other, and what are the different things within a call which are having an impact on the conversion rates. So for the second part, what we do is we bring in the context from the CRM. So let me show you. What you're able to do is you're able to actually look for trends within the calls based across different sales reps, but also based across different deal stages. So you could look for trends on, for all my deals that were lost, what was the actual outcome? Right. So did I have competitors being mentioned in more of them? Did I have, qualification questions come up in more of them, etc. So this can then become a great starting point for people to understand what is a winning talk track. The other thing that managers know intuitively and pretty well is which of their sales reps are doing a good job. But what is sometimes harder to understand is why is it that they're doing a good job? Because one is sales reps might not necessarily want to share their secret sauce, but also sometimes it's just second nature to them and they don't realize that that's something different that they're doing. So the dashboard helps you kind of tweak out trends across different sales reps. So you can see here, these are productivity metrics, the number of calls and the average call duration. And then you're also able to see the engagement metrics, which is what is the talk to listen ratio. If I'm able to talk less and engage my customer more, there's a much higher chance that I'll have a more meaningful conversation for the customer. Similarly, there is a pretty good correlation between the number of questions that the customer asks during a call and how much they speak during the call. And clearly, if they're asking questions, that means that they are engaged in the conversation. And again, so that's a good indicator, again, a positive metric that you want to drive within the team. Apart from these, you can actually set up your own types of metrics. So in what percentage of calls for integrations mentioned, are blockers showing up very often? How is that impacting my close rates across different types of reps? So all of these things you're able to kind of visually see very quickly in the dashboard. And from a manager's perspective, as you coach people and you want to be able to track whether their behavior is changing, the tool also allows you to do that. So you're able to see how does, I gave someone feedback on talk to listen ratio, then has their talk to listen ratio actually improved? So all of this becomes a lot more meaningful when you are able to bring in context from the CRM, because then you're able to see whether the impact in the talk to listen ratio also had an impact on close rates or win rates. So you can actually not just look at lead status, but you can actually import different types of data from the CRM. So one of the things that I really like about FreshSales is that it does a lead scoring automatically based on the engagement with the lead. Now you could actually bring in that information into the system right here, and then you could actually filter by leads which had a particular score to see whether they actually had a better close rate, or to see whether they had a specific type of questions that they were asking more often. So if you see that there are three types of CRM fields here, and within each, you can actually bring in whatever characteristic that is most meaningful. All right, so it could be based on a cohort, based on date, but it could also be based on the size of the company, revenue, etc. So it gives you a lot of flexibility. And you can also bring in this context into the cue cards that you set up, so that you're able to say that, hey, I want to show a particular case study that's relevant only to companies in the fintech area. And then you could have the cue card set up such that if the customer that I'm speaking with is in the fintech space, only then the cue card's showing up. And of course, since the way we kind of read off the CRM and push data back into the CRM is by matching the phone number or the email address. And what that does is that I have two-way access to exactly the same identity of the person, and then I can use that also when I'm looking for searching for all of the conversations with a particular contact, or searching within those, identifying trends within those. So there's also a search button which allows you to kind of search through anything and see how those conversations went. So in a sense, I think what FreshSales and FreshCaller provide is a seamless way for you to interact with your customers and to track those conversations, And what Wingman provides on top of that is the ability to do a 360-degree view of every single conversation, and additionally to actually give you the ability to get real-time assistance during those calls.